Guys, how do I even start a list like this? There have been so many bad decisions throughout history. Where do I even draw the line? I'm Mike with List 25, and here, in no particular order, are the worst decisions in history. The ancient and incredibly painful art of foot binding was designed to make Chinese women more attractive to male suitors. This look was desirable at one time, but I have something surprising to tell you. It wasn't the sole reason women did it, no pun intended. Binding their feet also made them more suitable for certain jobs and earning precious income for their family. Sitting down most of the day producing textiles was ideal if you couldn't walk very easily to begin with. Grim, but true. Parsley has actually been used at grave sites all throughout history. The Greeks believed that parsley represented oblivion and death, and in ancient Rome, parsley was associated with the Roman god of war, Mars, and was also used at people's grave sites. Though it's hard to imagine using parsley to decorate someone's grave these days, it'd be pretty common as far as history is concerned. In 1964, grad student Donald Russ Curry made a decision he'd regret forever. While studying bristlecone pines near Wheeler Park in Nevada, Curry struggled to extract a core sample from a particularly stubborn tree. Frustrated and running out of time, he convinced the U.S. Forest Service to cut it down. A week later, after analyzing its rings, Curry made a shocking discovery. The tree, named Prometheus, was over 4,800 years old. Later analysis revealed it was actually 5,100 years old, making it the oldest living tree in the world. Nina was 85 years old when it mysteriously vanished in the summer of 2013. The boat had a long and illustrious history, including winning the New York to Spain race only a month after its debut. In 2013, the yacht was owned by David Dyke. He intended to transport his prized vessel from New Zealand to Newcastle, Australia. Dyke and his crew set out on their expedition in late May 2013. However, Nina never arrived at her destination. After several days of hoping that the wet and stormy weather caused the delay, New Zealand's officials began the greatest maritime search in the country's history. Despite the best efforts, all missions to locate Nina and her crew failed. The once prized yacht is still officially missing. What is fascinating and noteworthy is the location of the disappearance. It's situated in the Bass Strait Triangle, a body of water that has claimed several ships since documented records of the area began. If it hadn't hit the iceberg in 1912, then the Titanic wouldn't have sunk. Correct, but the famous maritime disaster wasn't entirely due to a collision at sea. For starters, there were issues with the vessel's bulkhead design. Bulkheads are designed to contain water that comes in, plus they strengthen the ship. Titanic's bulkheads were believed to have been too shallow for such a big journey, with water quickly flowing over the top of them. There were also concerns about the quality of the iron rivets holding the hull together. There's far more to the Titanic story than an iceberg. There's a common misconception about Napoleon Bonaparte being incredibly short. While the image of a grumpy, pugnacious Napoleon is a charming and funny thought, it's far from the truth. Napoleon actually stood at just above 5 feet 6 inches, which is quite small by today's standards, but back in the early 1800s, that was an above average height. The imagery of a small Napoleon comes from a British cartoonist by the name of James Gilray, who depicted Napoleon as a small grumpy gentleman. Next time anyone ever accuses you of having a Napoleon complex, you can drop this little fact on them. It's hard to say who benefited the most from Hitler's bad decision to trust a horoscope, but one thing's for certain, it certainly didn't help him win the war. A superstitious man, Hitler consulted several astrologers during his reign, in the process giving British intelligence the perfect opportunity to exploit his beliefs. They hired Louis de Waal, a German Jewish refugee with a flair for the dramatic, to assist them with their psychological warfare. De Waal created fake horoscopes that turned the Nazi astrologers' lucky predictions into warnings of doom. By the time de Waal's department was shut down, his work had added to the paranoia and shaken the confidence of Hitler and his inner circle, all because he couldn't resist trusting the stars. On March 17, 1995, 6 teens left a spring break party in Pickering, where they had drunk a significant amount of alcohol. It was the last time they were ever seen. Many thought the teens could have taken a motorboat from Frenchman's Bay and headed out to Lake Ontario in their inebriated state. The theory was supported by a witness who informed the police that the teens had told him they would goof around on a boat. However, despite an extensive search, No bodies, boats, or clothing were ever discovered. In 2018, DNA testing revealed that a pair of Levi's pants Jay Boyle was thought to have worn belonged to another missing teenager, providing no clues about where the teens were or where their bodies may be. You've probably heard of the Wright brothers. You may also believe they single-handedly invented the idea of human flight. Well, not so. 9 years before the Wright brothers took off in 1903, Australian Lawrence Hargrave was suspended 16 feet above the ground while attached to a collection of box kites. And in 1901, Gustav Whitehead of Germany reportedly traveled through the air at a height of 50 feet in his own aircraft. Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence to back that up. It goes to show that the big names in history built on the legacies of those who went before them. Even someone who knows next to nothing about ancient Egypt is likely still able to tell you that cats were highly regarded as sacred animals by Egyptians of the time. The mummification of animals was commonly practiced at the time, and while many of the reasons for this practice was religious or sacrificial, it was also common for people to be put to rest with the mummified form of their most beloved pet, which at the time was commonly a cat. I think we can all understand wanting to be close to our beloved furry friends, even in the afterlife. One of the worst decisions of the American Civil War was putting James Wolfe Ripley in charge of Union weaponry. As Chief of Ordnance, Ripley decided breech-loading rifles were too expensive and stuck to outdated smoothbore models, even though they performed poorly. What truly sealed his reputation, though, was refusing to buy surplus Enfield rifles from Britain. He thought it was unpatriotic to rely on an old enemy, leaving the Confederates to snap them up and use them to crush the Union in early battles. After 2 years of poor decisions, Ripley was finally removed in 1863. The disappearance of Owen Parfitt from his sister's front porch in the English countryside is not as well known as Amelia Earhart's disappearance in 1937, but it is undoubtedly more bizarre. In the summer of 1763, or thereabouts, accounts disagree on the actual year, while living with his sister in the town of Shepton Mallet, the disabled 60-year-old Parfitt inexplicably vanished. He was last seen sitting on his favorite chair. He couldn't have walked off, as none of the farm workers across the field from the porch saw anyone come or go from Parfitt's porch. He was there 1 second, and then poof, just gone the next. Charles Lindbergh's name went down in history for flying solo across the Atlantic nonstop in 1927. However, he wasn't the first person to cross the Atlantic by air, as some may think. This actually happened in 1919. The aircraft that completed the trip was a Curtiss flying boat named NC-4, which held 6 naval pilots. There were 2 other flying boats, but they didn't fly the entire distance like the NC-4 did. It took them 24 days, and yes, they did stop. The 178th Pope of the Catholic Church from 1227 to 1241 is often remembered for issuing a papal bull declaring that cats bore Satan's spirit, which subsequently led to huge numbers of cats being killed throughout Europe. It was even believed that the mass extermination of cats indirectly allowed the bubonic plague to spread quicker because there was a small cat population to combat the disease-ridden rats. Beyond that, Gregory was characterized as being quick to anger and having a harsh personality. Yeah, I'd say causing the mass extermination of cats could be considered harsh. In 1857, the British made one of the most clueless decisions in colonial history. They introduced the Pattern 1853 Enfield rifle to Indian troops, which required soldiers to bite open cartridges greased with animal fat. I mean, it sounds pretty harmless, right? Well, not exactly. You see, the grease came from either pigs or cows, meaning Muslims who considered pigs unclean and Hindus who see cows as sacred were both horrified. This cultural insensitivity pushed tensions over the edge and led to the Sepoy Rebellion, a bloody uprising that raged for over a year. Barbara Bullock went hiking in the Bitterroot Mountains on July 18, 2007, with Jim Ramaker, a friend visiting from California. They were going to Bear Creek Overlook when Jim stopped to take in the scenery. Barbara was roughly 20 feet behind him at the time, but Jim reported that after turning away from her for less than a minute, he looked back and saw that she had vanished. A lengthy search of the area yielded no evidence of Barbara. Jim's story might seem ridiculous on the surface. However, he was reportedly very forthcoming with investigators, and because there's no indication that he did anything to Barbara, authorities did not consider him a suspect in her disappearance. It seems reasonable that a guilty person would try to concoct a much better story than his victim simply disappearing into thin air. It's been over 15 years, but officials have found no evidence of wrongdoing or any indication of what happened to Barbara Bullock. Einstein is regarded as a genius. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a clean slate when it comes to educational achievement. He was hot on physics, not so hot on subjects such as zoology and botany. There's also a myth that he messed up his algebra exams, but not only was Einstein good at algebra as a teen, he was a general whiz when it came to mathematics in general. He didn't perform brilliantly at everything, but he was brilliant in his chosen field, and that's what counts. God bless you may have been said with a different connotation back in ancient Greece. The Greeks believed that when someone sneezed, it meant that the gods had blessed them with good fortune. Some even believed that sneezing was a prophetic act, and it meant that you had been blessed with knowledge by gods. It's even been debated that the term God bless you comes from this time period, though evidence points to it being said much later. In 1915, German diplomat Heinrich Albert, who was funding a World War I spy ring in America, made a big mistake. He decided to take a nap while riding the subway in New York. When a sudden stop startled him awake, he rushed off the train, forgetting one very important thing: his briefcase. That briefcase, packed with incriminating documents, was quickly snatched up by Frank Burke, a Secret Service agent tailing him. Albert gave chase, but Burke escaped on a trolley. Instead of confronting Germany, the US leaked the files to the press. The scandal swayed American public opinion closer to joining the war, and the involved diplomats were sent packing. In 1946, Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old Bennington College sophomore, went for a walk and never returned. The search for Paula was centered around Vermont's Long Trail, but delivered no results. Unusual leads materialized. A waitress claimed she served a distressed girl that looked like Paula, and her father became a suspect himself after pursuing this lead. Several reports suggested Paula's home life wasn't as rosy as believed. She hadn't returned home for Thanksgiving, possibly due to a fight. A local man later claimed that he knew where she had been buried, but couldn't provide any evidence. The case turned colder with time. As these things go, it wasn't long before occult-related theories emerged, including the theories regarding the Bennington Triangle, even going so far as to suggest that extraterrestrial beings might have abducted Paula due to a unique energy in the forest. Legend of the movie biz Orson Welles caused controversy when his live radio broadcast of The War of the Worlds was broadcast during Halloween in 1938. The popular narrative about his adaptation of the book by H.G. Wells, no relation, is that it terrified the listening public. It's an amazing story, but it's just that, a story. Research showed that only 2% out of an already small audience were affected, so only a tiny number of people believe the action was real. Onions have a reputation of being used for medicinal purposes throughout history, but this was taken a bit further during ancient Egypt. It was a common belief that onions could be used to ward off evil spirits. It's even said that they would put onions in the eye sockets of the deceased for protection in the afterlife. Maybe Shrek was onto something with the whole onion thing. More than a century before Captain James Cook claimed Australia for Britain in 1770, the Dutch had already been there. Back in 1606, Willem Janssen and his ship the Duifken explored about 200 miles of the Cape York Peninsula's western coast. Other Dutch explorers followed, mapping parts of the western and southern coasts and even naming the place New Holland. But here's the thing, they never bothered to claim it. No settlements, no flags, nothing. So when Cook showed up in 1770, he planted the British flag, and the rest is history. After World War II, James and Pearl Tedford returned to Vermont. Upon James's return to their rented residence after his second military stint in 1947, he discovered Pearl missing. His family only knew that she had last been seen walking to the store. Despite his searches, she was never found. Then in 1949, James also vanished while on a bus passing through the Green Mountain Forest. All 14 passengers on the bus confirmed that he had been seen on the bus, and they had all seen him sleeping. But he disappeared from his spot before their arrival while his bags remained stowed on the bus. The forest was known for creepy events, which added to the mystery of James Tedford's disappearance. Alexander Hamilton had a smash hit musical written about him. His story is arguably more well known than it's ever been. He's the guy who wanted to free the slaves, right? Well, he was, I guess. The influential founding father definitely wanted to abolish slavery, that much is true. But it isn't as simple as that, though. He's believed to have been less than outspoken on the subject when trying to fit into 18th century high society. There are also conversations about whether he bought slaves himself. Seems Hamilton didn't practice what he preached when it came to this controversial issue. After signing a treaty, Napoleon organized a rabbit hunt for him and his men. Hundreds of rabbits were collected in preparation, but when the hunt began, the rabbits did something unexpected. They turned towards the would-be hunters, and instead of running away, attacked them. A story of the event tells that while they initially laughed at the occurrence, as the rabbits persisted, even the famous Napoleon fled in retreat from the overwhelming onslaught of bunnies. When George A. Custer set out for the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he made a fateful decision to leave his newly patented Gatling guns behind. In his mind, the guns were heavy and they would only slow down his march. That decision turned out to be a deadly mistake. Without the firepower to hold off the overwhelming Sioux and Cheyenne forces, the general and over 250 men of the 7th Cavalry were killed in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. Believe it or not, there have been several accounts of people disappearing into strange white fogs or mist throughout history. One such account is of Chilean Air Force pilot, First Lieutenant Alejandro Bello Silva, who in 1914 vanished into a weird mist and was never seen or heard from again. Witnesses saw the young but competent pilot taking part in exercises when his plane entered a strange cloud formation. They expected the plane to reappear seconds later, but he never reappeared. Despite an extensive search, neither the plane nor Silva was ever found. It was as if he entered the cloud and then vanished into thin air. The disappearance made national headlines in Chile, and the search for his aircraft was renewed periodically. Surprisingly, the story inspired a Chilean saying to describe persons who disappear while on their way somewhere. They are said to be more lost than Lieutenant Bello. George Washington's crossing of the River Delaware in 1776 is one of the defining images of American history. Defining, but not very accurate. The popular version is that he and his men rowed across in little boats as shown in the classic painting. This isn't the case. Washington stepped aboard a heavier boat, measuring up to 60 feet long and 8 feet wide. This type of vessel is referred to as a Durham boat. It's also incorrect that he made the crossing on Christmas Eve. Instead, it happened on the 25th and 26th of December. Okay, story time. Once upon a time, it was illegal for a commoner to own swans, and nobles would have to get permission from the monarchy to own swans. In the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I wanted to have swans round up, then swans taken from wealthy nobles. When the issue was taken to the court sided with the Queen, ruling that she had a legal right to any swans on English soil. To this day, it is a law that every member of the British royal family has a right to any swan. Elizabeth Swan? The Gallipoli campaign in World War I was full of poor choices, but one in particular led to devastating losses: the failure to synchronize watches. During a key operation, Allied naval forces ended their bombardment 7 minutes early. Nobody checked to see if the ground troops were ready, and the Turkish defenders used that time to regroup. When the 600 Australian soldiers charged, they walked straight into Turkish gunfire. More than half were either killed or wounded instantly. The lack of coordination led to massive casualties and eventually forced the Allies to abandon the campaign, leaving the Ottomans with a decisive victory. Lars Mittank holds the unfortunate title of the most famous missing person on YouTube. In July 2014, 28-year-old Lars Mittank of Germany traveled to Bulgaria to visit a friend. While partying on the beach, he got into a fist fight with some of the other tourists over football. Mittank ruptured his eardrum during the fight and was told not to fly home until it healed. During that time, Mittank found a room in a hostel in a poorer part of town and persuaded his pals to return to Germany without him. Mittank was terrified and paranoid after spending the night in the hostel. His mother received a frightening text from him saying that he didn't feel safe, that she should cancel his credit cards, and that 4 unknown men were following him. According to the doctor, Lars arrived at his office for his appointment that day, but when he arrived, Lars jumped up and rushed out. He instantly headed to the airport and was caught on CCTV walking around with his baggage. He walks off screen and then is shown running out of the airport with his luggage, hopping over the fence, and fleeing into the forest. He was never seen or heard from again. The expression Victorian values suggests a puritanical approach to society, as seen in the Victorian era. Turns out the history books have been economical with the truth. Saying Victorians were prudes is a sweeping statement. Back then, you had prostitution, plus a lot of working class women getting married while pregnant. This contradicts the popular image of waiting until the wedding day before having intercourse. On the male side, gambling was a big deal. In fact, the wealthiest people were known to frequently take part in this sinful activity. It was a common belief of vampire lore at the time that someone with the vampiric curse would have to die before coming back to life as a vampire. People that were believed to have the vampiric curse would be buried with a rock in their mouth in an effort to keep them from chewing their way through the dirt and escaping their burial. While not a commonly practiced burial rite, there are several reports and discoveries of people being buried in such a manner throughout history. Oh boy, that heading alone should be enough. The US decision to support the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a disaster waiting to happen. The plan? Train and arm 1,400 Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro. The problem? Almost everything. First, the US assumed the Cuban people would rise up against Castro. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Then they underestimated Castro's forces while overestimating what the exiles could do. And to top it all off, the US limited military support to keep the operation deniable, leaving the exiles outgunned and isolated. The invasion was a humiliating failure. It strengthened Castro's grip on power and embarrassed the US on the global stage. In June 1962, convicts Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and his brother John Anglin joined a small group of men that escaped from Alcatraz. They escaped via ventilation ducts and used a makeshift raft across the water. Alcatraz, built in the mid-19th century on a small island 1¼ miles off the coast of San Francisco, was initially used as a lighthouse and military jail. From 1934 through 1963, it served as a civilian prison, housing renowned figures such as Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly. During that time, 14 escape attempts involving 36 detainees were made. 6 were shot and killed, 23 apprehended, and 4 were verified drowned. No sign apart from bits and pieces of the raft and a few personal belongings of the men have ever been found. Although, if I do remember, there is a fantastic episode of Expedition Unknown. So, Josh Gates, you incredible, incredible man. Check out that episode. It's really cool. Tempting as it is to think of Old West locations such as Tombstone being the scene of violent encounters, the truth is, the West isn't as wild as people think. People struggled and times were tough, but factors such as poverty and surviving on land were more important than whether a bandit was going to pull a gun on you. Famous historical figures like Calamity Jane died from pneumonia and alcohol, not bullets. But as we all know, Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. Thank you, Dr. Swift. Many things have been sold as medicine, and it seems not even everyone's favorite fry dip isn't immune. In the 1830s, ketchup was sold as a cure for diarrhea, indigestion, and even jaundice. The recipe was altered to be sold in the form of a pill. In fact, there were whole empires of these tomato pill sellers in the 1800s, all to sell a solidified form of ketchup. In 1840, more than 500 Maori chiefs made the historic decision to sign the Treaty of Waitangi, a historic agreement with the British Crown. The treaty promised to protect Maori land and rights while allowing British immigration and governance in New Zealand. But there was a major problem. The treaty's Maori translation didn't match the English version. The Maori text implied they would retain territorial control while granting governance to the British. However, the English version demanded a full surrender of authority. This mistranslation has sparked conflict and debate ever since. 8-year-old Nicole Morin left her mother's penthouse apartment in the West Mall apartment building in Toronto, Ontario on July 30th, 1985. Nicole had arrangements to swim in the building's pool with a friend after collecting the mail from the lobby area at 10:30 a.m. She greeted her mother and exited the apartment, but her friend buzzed the door again 15 minutes later to find out why Nicole hadn't arrived. Nicole's disappearance prompted one of the most extensive police investigations in Toronto history, but no trace of her was ever found. The most plausible explanation was that Nicole was abducted shortly after she left the apartment. Still, the building was 20 stories high, making it extremely difficult to get her out of there unnoticed. Authorities have never found any credible evidence to identify what happened to Nicole Morin nearly 30 years later. The Hollywood image of cowboys as exclusively white is inaccurate. You see, There were also African American and Mexican cowboys. They made a big impact on the scene out there. For example, if it wasn't for the vaqueros of Mexico, U.S. ranchers wouldn't ride on horses or handle them in the way they do. Vaquero culture, originating in Spain, had been around for hundreds of years before America as we know it came into being. For a few shining moments in the early 1900s, those who had a special passion for tug of war could see the sport performed at an Olympic level. It was included alongside other track and field sports. During its time as an Olympic sport, countries were able to enter multiple teams, and it was possible for a country to win all 3 medals. While the likeness of this happening was low, it didn't stop the US from winning all 3 in 1904. Marie Antoinette was the queen of questionable choices, but her decision during the infamous Flight to Varennes guaranteed her downfall. Initially, Louis XVI planned on leaving Paris alone, rallying his allies and staging a counter-revolution. But Marie insisted that the whole family, including the children, travel together. Then, instead of a discreet getaway carriage, they opted for a large, luxurious one, complete with all the trappings of royalty. Their slow, aristocratic display drew suspicion, the family was recognized, and the alarm was raised. The revolutionaries stopped the royal family, and their capture was the beginning of the end. Clint Eastwood's film Changeling, released in 2008, reignited attention to one of the 1920s most bizarre and heartbreaking crime stories. Christine Collins, a single mother, reported her 9-year-old son Walter missing from their LA home in March 1928. 5 months later, the police returned Walter to Christine, but it wasn't Walter, and she knew it. However, the LAPD rejected Christine's complaints, even accusing her of bad mothering and placing her in a mental hospital. The actual Walter Collins was never found, and officials eventually concluded that he had been one of the many victims of convicted child murderer Gordon Stewart Northcott. It remains unclear why the police were so intent on covering up the boy's disappearance that they delivered a different child back to Christine and tried to persuade her and everyone else that it was Walter. "What we do in life echoes in eternity," said Maximus in Gladiator. Since gladiators had short and brutal lives, they needed to make their deeds count. Or did they? Gladiators didn't die as much as people thought. The reasons for this were driven by business interests. Look at it this way. If you own a prize fighter, you're not going to casually send them to their grave, are you? The average gladiator reportedly received medical treatment after a fight. They weren't just disposable meat puppets who died for the entertainment of the masses. Abraham Lincoln definitely had a certain charisma about him. His word chosen with purpose and meaning. It almost seems like his natural charisma is effortless. It's hard to imagine Abraham Lincoln keeping speech notes about his person, but it's completely possible. Lincoln kept important notes in his famous top hat. In fact, he kept many things in his top hat, using it as a sort of mini briefcase. Fashionable and functional, Lincoln really was a fashion icon. Maybe we should just ditch wallets and start wearing top hats again. I would love to leave Hitler out of our content, but the man honestly gave historians so much to work with. After World War I, a disillusioned Adolf Hitler found himself working as an intelligence officer for the German army. His job was to monitor the German Workers' Party, or DAP, a small group suspected of Marxist leanings. But when Hitler attended their meetings, he found himself drawn to their anti-Semitic and ultra-nationalist rhetoric. So, in 1919, he joined the party and quickly rose to prominence. By 1920, he had renamed the group the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. His fiery speeches attracted thousands of supporters and paved the way for the Nazis to seize power in 1933. And then he just spent the rest of his time throwing his heart out to people. The Nation of Islam, NOI founder Wallace D. Ford ascended from being a silk vendor on Detroit's streets to being a preacher and self-proclaimed savior of all African American people. From 1930 until 1934, he had a short but very influential stint as NOI leader in Detroit and several run-ins with the law. Though various myths about his origins abound, there is very little recorded biographical information about him. He claimed to have been born in Mecca, but the FBI's investigation showed that he was born in New Zealand and lived a life of a juvenile scofflaw after he reached the US. He vanished in 1934. The Nation of Islam celebrates him each year on February 26th. They refer to him as the Prophet and believe him to be the incarnation of Allah. The world has Alexander Graham Bell to thank for the invention of the telephone. Actually, it doesn't. The device is also credited to Antonio Meucci, an Italian who developed an electrical communication system. He did this in order to be able to talk to his wife, who was paralyzed. Meucci was gifted, but lacked the finances to get his apparatus recognized. He wasn't happy when Bell announced his telephone either. Meucci took legal action, though sadly, he passed away during proceedings. The U.S. House of Representatives acknowledged him as the inventor of the telephone in 2002. Our perception of time is odd sometimes. It's the exact feeling I felt when I realized that Oxford University was founded in 1096, 230 years before the Aztec Empire began its reign. It's pretty crazy to think that Oxford University had already been around for over 200 years by the time the Aztecs came around. Okay, what was Napoleon thinking? Was he bored? Restless? The man had conquered almost all of Europe, racking up victory after victory, and then decided to point his massive army, over 600,000 men, at Mother Russia. As we all know, it didn't go well. The Russians refused to fight head-on, retreating instead and burning everything in their path. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, he found nothing but smoking ruins. Frustrated with no clear win, he turned his army around. And that's when things went from bad to worse. Russian forces harassed his troops at every turn, supply lines were non-existent, and winter hit hard. By the time his army limped home, less than a third of his soldiers were still alive. On August 18, 2010, Ben McDaniel, a 30-year-old scuba diver, went diving in the underwater cave at Vortex Springs. He attempted to enter a risky cave area by tampering with a gate that restricted uncertified divers. 2 employees were diving at the same time and saw what he was doing, but decided to let him in. It took the employees 2 days to discover his vehicle hadn't moved since he went diving, and they contacted the police. Recovery divers searched every nook and cranny of the cave, but couldn't find him. McDaniel's parents offered a $30,000 reward to any diver willing to risk their lives to go deeper into the cave in search of their son. Many believe that McDaniel drowned and his body had been buried under the sand. Others think he committed suicide and pressed himself into a tiny area beforehand, ensuring that no one would ever get him out. Spartans weren't all about swords and conquest. Did you know they also had an education system which gave lessons in subjects such as dance and poetry? There was carnage for sure, but the warriors engaging in violent acts was more soulful than you might think. Also, women in Spartan society had the right to do things like manage property and take part in sports. Not incredibly progressive, but definitely an enlightened attitude compared to other cultures at the time. While it was rare, there are plenty of accounts of female gladiators during the time of ancient Rome. They were known as the gladiatrix, and they fought other gladiatrixes. They fought others of their same kind, and though there weren't many, they were known throughout the land. So next time someone says it's unrealistic when watching a show or movie where there's a strong female fighter, just remind them of the gladiatrix. As a dictator obsessed with personal security, Stalin forbade anyone from entering his room without permission, a decision that would come back to haunt him. One day, when Stalin didn't appear for his usual routine, his guards were hesitant to go into his chambers. Entering uninvited could mean execution, but ignoring an actual emergency could cost them their lives too. So, trapped in this impossible dilemma, they decided to wait it out. When someone finally worked up the courage to check, they found Stalin on the floor, helpless after a massive stroke. He died 4 days later. On December 17, 1967, all of Australia was bewildered by the disappearance of their Prime Minister, Harold Holt. Holt had gone swimming at Cheviot Beach near Melbourne and never returned. The Australian authorities launched one of modern history's largest search and rescue missions. Holt was 59 years old and in good mental and physical health at the time of his disappearance. However, he fainted earlier in the year during a parliamentary hearing. People close to him also said Holt had a shoulder injury. Some speculate that Holt drowned in the Cheviot Beach riptides. Others think the Prime Minister was depressed and opted to end his life. Other conspiracy theories suggest that Holt was kidnapped by the Soviet Union or a Chinese submarine since he supported the Vietnam War. The Statue of Liberty is green, though you may not know why that is. It wasn't painted that color. What you're seeing is verdigris, or a chemical reaction. The statue's exterior is made of copper, and that's reacting to the air. technically Lady Liberty should be a healthy shade of brown. Is there anything you know about history that may surprise the List 25 team? Well, feel free to tell us about it in the comments once the video's over. Despite its original purpose being a mere gift from the French, the statue was used to function as a lighthouse when it was opened in 1886. It's unclear whether or not the original designs intended for the statue to be used in such a way, but it was fitted with lighting mechanisms nevertheless. By 1889, Lady Liberty was no longer listed as a functioning lighthouse in the US. More electric lights were placed in the lighthouse again in 1892, but they were meant more for decorative purposes. The Austro-Turkish War of 1788 to 1791 gave us one of history's most ridiculous friendly fire incidents, all thanks to wine and poor decisions. On the night of September 21st, Austrian hussars crossed a river to scout for Ottoman troops. However, instead of enemy soldiers, they found wine, and they got drunk. Worried about his men, the commanders sent infantry to find them, and as these things go, the infantry demanded the hussars share their booze, and a fight broke out. A shot was fired, someone yelled, "Turks!" and chaos ensued. Back at the camp, an artillery officer mistook the chaos for an attack and ordered cannon fire. Soldiers woke up and joined the mayhem, firing blindly. 2 days later, the Ottomans arrived to find thousands of casualties and an abandoned camp. Sodder family's home was destroyed by fire on Christmas Eve 1945. George and Jenny escaped with 4 of their children, believing the remaining 5 had perished in the fire. However, when firefighters arrived and investigated the house's ruins, they discovered no evidence of the 5 missing children. No bones, no teeth, nor any other remains. There were several strange discoveries concerning the Sodder house. Their phone line, which was supposed to have been destroyed in the fire, was found to have been cut beforehand. In the days that followed, neither of their trucks would start. Officials suspected tampering. According to experts, the fire was not intense enough to incinerate bone. All the facts pointed to premeditation and, potentially, kidnapping. The surviving children of the Sodders have always maintained that the 5 missing children were kidnapped and are still alive. Chivalry was the code of conduct for medieval knights. They were expected to obey its rules. But how did that work in reality? Well, it's different to what you see in some history books, that's for sure. An important thing to know is that chivalry was introduced to keep knights under control. What I'm saying is they already had a problem with violent, amoral behavior in the ranks. A group of thugs with swords being told to follow a bunch of complicated rules? That doesn't really sound like a good combination to me. Recent studies have discovered that Alexander the Great suffered from a rare disease in his last years that left him paralyzed. It slowed his heart rate and locked his muscles, making it so he appeared dead. When he was prepared and buried, he was likely still alive but completely unable to move, speak, or breathe to let anyone know that he was really alive. Okay, so moving away from wars to a financial ouchie, or disaster, for a second, in 2014, Bank of America, led by CEO Brian Moynihan, made the costly decision to announce plans to increase its quarterly dividend from 1 cent to 5 cents per share and initiate a $4 billion stock buyback, thinking they had passed the Federal Reserve stress test. The problem? They actually hadn't passed. The bank miscalculated the value of some Merrill Lynch bonds, which led to the premature announcement. When the error was revealed, the fallout was swift and brutal. Shareholders were furious, and the bank's stock lost $9 billion in value in a single day. In November 1930, Joe LaBelle came upon an Inuit community near Anjikuni Lake in Nunavut, Canada. There was no sign of the 30-person community, even though their food, fish supply, and possessions remained full and untouched. LaBelle notified the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, at the nearest telegraph office. They dispatched a unit to the remote settlement. They stopped at the home of Armand Laurent, who eerily enough told them about an odd glimmering object that had flown over his land a few nights before heading towards Anjikuni Lake. When the Mounties made it to the Inuit community, they discovered it had been completely abandoned. On top of that, the graves on the outskirts of the village all appeared broken open and were missing their respective bodies. The police team eventually concluded that the Inuit had been absent almost 8 weeks before LaBelle arrived. Did you hear the old story about medieval people thinking the earth was flat? Well, in that case, you need to be told the truth. For example, in 240 BCE, the ancient Greek geographer Eratosthenes performed calculations to determine the shape of the planet, and concluded it was a sphere. Many great thinkers were considering this very question centuries before medieval times. Even though we know her as one of ancient Egypt's best rulers, she was never actually Egyptian. She was born in Egypt, but her family was of Greek descent, and they had been ruling over Egypt long before Cleopatra was born. Cleopatra was the last ruler of her line and the last active ruler of Egypt before it was taken over by Rome after her death. In 1999, NASA lost the $125 million Mars Climate Orbiter due to a disastrous oversight, conflicting measurement systems. The engineering team at Lockheed Martin used English units, while NASA worked with the metric system. This mismatch wasn't identified during key reviews, and the miscalculation sent the orbiter on a trajectory that caused it to burn up in Mars's atmosphere. Now, obviously, this wasn't just one person's decision, but rather a series of choices to skip double-checking calculations and not enforce standardization that led to this costly mishap. For NASA, it was a painful lesson in how small errors in planning can lead to massive failures. Ouchie. 12 years ago, the disappearance of Indiana University student Lauren Spearer sent shockwaves across many American colleges. Authorities say the 20-year-old went missing after spending the early hours drinking at a downtown bar in Bloomington, Indiana. Her disappearance launched a national manhunt, prompting several celebrities, including comedian Stephen Colbert and reality star Kim Kardashian, to use social media to raise awareness about the young woman's disappearance. 3 lakes and 2 forests were sought out by the searchers, not to mention 99% of all of the Monroe County roads, as well as the majority of publicly accessible land inside a 114 square mile radius. However, investigators are still unable to trace her today, and countless leads have led to dead ends. The early Middle Ages sounds like a dark time, but how dark was it? The so-called Dark Ages you've heard about are only presented that way in relation to the achievements of ancient Rome. Civilizations didn't fall when the Roman Empire did. Historians have been uncovering just how enlightened the Dark Ages were. For instance, they practiced astronomy and mathematics. It's also believed that our tradition of universities started life in this period. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was a conflict fought between Great Britain and, well, you guessed it, Zanzibar. When the pro-British Sultan of Zanzibar died, they were replaced by a sultan that didn't like Britain. The British declared that they had a rightful cause for war as a threat to the new sultan, but when he just ignored them, there was a battle that lasted for just 38 minutes. On December 7th, 1941, at 7:48 a.m., hundreds of Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, sinking battleships and destroying over 300 airplanes. While the attack caused devastating damage, Japan's decision to prioritize the US's battleships over their fuel reserves and repair yards was a massive mistake. To make matters worse, the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, the most important and critical naval assets, were away from the base that day. As a result of Japan's missteps, the US Navy recovered quickly, declared war the next day, and eventually took control of the Pacific. February 1979, 5 friends left the shore of Maui on a small boat called the Sarah Joe for a fun day of fishing, and motored into one of Hawaii's most significant storms on record. When they didn't return, a massive search was launched, but nothing was uncovered. A tragic story, but not unusual in the case of a maritime disaster. Then, things got strange. A decade later, the Sarah Joe was discovered shipwrecked on the shores of one of the Marshall Islands, close to the grave of one of the 5 men. How did the man end up there? Who buried him? And where's the rest of the group? We may never know the answers. In the late 18th century, tensions between American colonists and their British rulers were rising. The newly announced Townshend Acts added to this tension because they were thought to punish the colonists financially. Colonists didn't want to bow to British rule, and so violence ensued. During a public confrontation in Boston, they were fired upon and killed by British soldiers. The story of the shooting is described as the Boston Massacre, which suggests a bloodbath. In actuality, the casualty numbers are way smaller. 5 colonists were murdered and everyone else was injured. Terrible, yes, but not a massacre. The word was used by patriots to frame a narrative of authority versus resistance. While most presidents like to remain in the public eye after their presidency, whether it be political activism, writing books, or just making public appearances, our nation's first president had a different idea. George Washington, rather than remain in politics or the military, was convinced by one of his workers that he should open a distillery. The first president took the gamble and actually made a pretty noteworthy career in whiskey making. You can even buy Washington's whiskey to this day right from the distillery in Mount Vernon. One of World War II's most significant moments caught Erwin Rommel completely off guard. Tasked with defending the coast of France, Rommel decided to fly to Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday. Now, to be fair, weeks of bad weather and enemy inactivity made an invasion seem unlikely. But when D-Day arrived on June 6th, Rommel was nowhere to be found, and the German defenses were left in disarray. By the time he returned, the Allies had a firm grip on the beaches, and the Germans never regained control. During World War I, an entire battalion of the British Army mysteriously vanished during a battle, leaving no trace behind. In 1965, a fellow soldier, Frederick Reichardt, shared his account of the strange brown cloud that lay in front of the soldiers as they marched into the forest. As the cloud moved away, there was only empty ground instead of the expected sight of hundreds of British soldiers. Hundreds of soldiers had seemingly disappeared without any noise or struggle. As you can imagine, his account led to weird theories on mass alien abductions. The most plausible explanation is that Colonel Beecham and the Sandringham unit were overwhelmed by their Turkish adversaries. As the Turks didn't take prisoners, they were likely killed and then buried. Christopher Columbus played an important role in the discovery of the Americas in the late 15th century. Of course, he wasn't the first to find them, as some history books state, because there were indigenous people there already. When he and his crew landed, they brought infections the inhabitants of the Americas had never encountered before. This proved deadly for them. He didn't set out to become a villain, but Columbus's actions led to the deaths of millions of people from disease. After years of one of the most brutal wars the human race has ever seen, the elation that the entire world felt at the end of World War II was just in the air. Russians, however, took to a different kind of feeling, as the country as a whole drank so much vodka in celebration of the end of the war that they ran out. Now, that's a lot of vodka. To be fair, a good portion of vodka production had been halted and there wasn't much left to begin with. In 1958, Mao Zedong decided to launch the Great Leap Forward. His plan was to transform China's economy by reorganizing agriculture and industry into massive communes. I mean, it sounds great when I say it like that, and I'm sure it looked good on paper. The plan was ambitious and completely unworkable. Farmers were forced to abandon traditional methods for untested practices, and unrealistic quotas meant crops were overreported or wasted. Meanwhile, labor was redirected to backyard steel furnaces that produced little of value. The consequences were catastrophic. In the wake of widespread crop failures and mismanagement, an estimated 15 to 45 million people died from starvation. One of the most unnatural disappearances are those that include whole groups of people. In February 1923, the 600 inhabitants of the Brazilian village of Ouro Verde vanished overnight. If they left their village willingly, they did so without taking any of their belongings or food. A small group of tourists discovered the abandoned village and contacted the local police, who found no trace of anyone or any indication of where the residents might have gone. The story doesn't end there, however. The police did find a gun, which was later confirmed to have been recently fired, as well as a puzzling note on the blackboard inside the school that read, "There is no salvation." Apart from a few wild theories regarding mass alien abductions, most people believe that Brazil's political situation and the ongoing revolution in some way led to their sudden disappearance. Without medieval churches, there may not have been universities in Europe. This may sound surprising to you. We're often told that medieval monks and other scary people from the period were strict in their teachings and that they didn't take a broad approach to education. Well, it appears the opposite is true. Theology studies included science and mathematics as part of the teaching plan. The church was actually more sophisticated than we give it credit for. During the Renaissance, tablecloths began to be used as a sort of napkin, to be used by everyone at the table. While this wasn't the original purpose of a tablecloth, it was very common to find a messy one left after a meal during the Renaissance. Towards the end of that time period, the communal napkin use of the tablecloth lessened greatly. It began to be more common for a servant to carry a much smaller cloth, but there were still those that continued to wipe their mouths right onto the tablecloth. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the US for $7.2 million. At the time, Russia saw Alaska as a liability. The Crimean War exposed how hard it was to defend or supply the remote territory, especially with British and Allied ships controlling the seas. Meanwhile, relations between Russia and the US were strong, so selling Alaska seemed like a mutually beneficial move. But Russia underestimated the land's value. By the 1880s, gold mining had begun, and America reaped hundreds of millions of dollars in wealth. Today, Alaska produces more gold than any US state, except for Nevada. On June 25, 1986, a Volvo F12 truck carrying sulfuric acid had a tragic accident on the Somosierra mountain pass in Madrid, Spain. The truck's brakes failed, leading to a collision with an oncoming truck. The acid ended up spilling on the road. The cabin contained a man and a woman, later identified as Andres Martinez and Carmen Gomez, who were both deceased. The couple had a 10-year-old son named Juan Pedro Martinez. Despite searches of the area, Juan Pedro was never located. Although it has been speculated that the acid disintegrated him, experts disagree, noting that traces of his body would have remained. The truck's tachometer showed scheduled stops, but odd short stops occurred during the pass ascent. A witness saw a white Nissan van with a man and a blonde woman near the accident. The woman had claimed to be a nurse. Another account mentioned a Nordic-looking couple collecting something from the wreckage. It certainly does. However, things become confused when you hear a simple yet totally wrong so-called fact. Think the Nile is the only river that goes in a northward direction? Well, if you did think that, well, you've been misled. It isn't the case that all rivers except the Nile prefer to go south. We don't exactly know where the story came from. Many flow north, and there are at least 18 major rivers that do this. During the industrial era, people had to wake up early in the morning so they could get to their factory jobs on time. They didn't have any form of alarm clock, but they did have knocker-uppers. Knocker-uppers were people who were paid to wake up a factory worker. They would tap on a person's window or door and wouldn't stop or leave until the person acknowledged they were awake. With how many alarms I sleep through, maybe it'd be a good idea to go back to this method. When the RMS Titanic sank in 1912, over 1,500 people died, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters of all time. But the real tragedy is that it didn't have to be that way. The Titanic's designers made a series of fatal decisions. When the ship was originally designed to hold 32 lifeboats, only 20 were included, enough for just 1,178 of the more than 2,200 people on board. There was also the bulkhead design flaw. The compartments weren't fully sealed at the top, so as one filled up, it spilled over into the next, accelerating the sinking. Adding to the disaster, Captain Smith decided to speed up the ship's arrival date. When the iceberg struck, the limited lifeboats in freezing waters left little chance for survival. 2,200 on board, and they all want messages delivered. If you can tell me where that is from, whew, that's a deep cut. Percy Fawcett went down in history as the man who vanished in the Amazon while looking for an ancient city called Z. During preliminary explorations, Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel, Jack's close friend, discovered several promising discoveries. They set out from Cuiabá, their hometown. When they were about 250 miles from their starting point, Fawcett told his Brazilian assistants to return home and deliver a letter to his wife. Nothing was ever heard of Fawcett, his son, or Raleigh ever again. After a few years, a Swiss man claimed to have met Fawcett, now an elderly man. He assembled a group of reporters and led them to the location, only for the whole group to disappear. Many additional expeditions have been dispatched to look for traces of Fawcett and the others since, but they have all come up empty-handed. Betsy Ross was an upholsterer who is credited with sewing the very first American flag back in 1776. The story of how she was asked to do this by the Congressional Committee is inspiring, but sadly that honor may belong to someone else. Continental Congress member Francis Hopkinson, also one of the founding fathers, is believed to be the original flag designer. The exact truth isn't known. Ross appears to have been overlooked in the official chronicle of what happened. Her family have promoted her involvement, though there isn't definitive proof she was behind the iconic stars and stripes. The pineapple has had plenty of symbolic meanings with many cultures, but in 18th century England, that symbol was one of power and worth. Shockingly enough, pineapple is not native to England, and it was considered an exotic food of exclusivity due to its rarity. It was pretty common for many exotic items to be directly tied to a person's worth in England at the time. Things like pearls, spices, and other tropical fruits were all given similar treatment. The Chernobyl disaster didn't just happen, it was practically invited. On April 26, 1986, during a late-night safety test, the plant's operators decided to disable their critical safety systems to simulate a power failure. Smart, right? If that wasn't bad enough, they ignored protocols and ran the reactor at dangerously low power, something even the checklist warned them against. Oh, and let's not forget the reactor's design flaws, which made it as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. The result? A massive explosion, a raging fire, and radiation exposure that affected millions. Solomon Northup's story is one of terrible adversity and incredible determination. Northup was born free in New York in 1808, but in 1841 he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. He was owned by a series of heartless owners until 1852 when he found a way to deliver messages to his family. His freedom was formally restored in 1853, and Northup went on to co-write the best-selling memoir 12 Years a Slave. Fame waited around the corner, and Northup soon gave lectures all across the United States. Despite being charged with his kidnapping, his kidnappers were later cleared of all charges. It was at this point that Northup disappeared from the public eye. It's been speculated that he might have joined the Underground Railroad. However, his ultimate whereabouts and any details about his death were never discovered. If you think the traditional Japanese geisha was also a sex worker, well, then you need to do your research. A geisha was trained to play music and dance, as well as engage their employers and guests in conversation. They're entertainers, not escorts. During the Edo period of 1603 to 1868, they were banned from becoming sex workers. So, where did this X-rated image come from? It was due to a misconception that Allied servicemen had of geishas when sleeping with women during the US occupation there. It may sound crazy, but it's true. Olympic medals were given out for paintings and drawings just the same as running and water polo. In fact, for 40 years, they gave out medals in a variety of different art categories, including sculpture, painting, drawing, and even architecture. In total, over 150 medals were given out to various different art pieces from 1912 to 1952. Could you imagine seeing someone like Bob Ross at the Olympics painting? Awesome. Rawsome. Just came up with that one myself. Oh, Hitler. I promise this is the last time he features on today's list. I mean, don't despots ever learn? I mean, just look at number 13. Swap Napoleon for Hitler, Russia for the Soviet Union, and La Grande Armée for the Wehrmacht, and you have the gist of this story. On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler decided to launch Operation Barbarossa, the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union. Like Napoleon, he underestimated the brutal Russian winter and Soviet resistance. By November, the Wehrmacht had lost 750,000 troops, and his quick victory was a pipe dream. To make it worse, the invasion pushed Stalin to join the Allies. If Hitler had taken the time to learn from Napoleon's disaster, he might have avoided this colossal mistake, but as we all know, history has a way of repeating itself. But I'm glad he failed. I want to throw that out there. Not saying he should have done it. Just want to be clear on that. Glad he made all these mistakes. The Madagascar merchant ship journeyed from Melbourne to London in 1853 when it vanished. It was ferrying both passengers and cargo during its final journey. There are quite a few theories about what happened to the Madagascar, as with any missing ship. However, the story of the Madagascar is fascinating, not only because it vanished, but also because of events that transpired before the ship left Australia. The Madagascar was carrying 110 travelers, wool, grains, and 2 tons of gold when it went missing. On the day it left port, 3 passengers were suddenly arrested. Many believe they were part of a larger group of pirates that ultimately hijacked the ship and murdered the other passengers. To this day, the fate of the Madagascar remains unknown. The elite English school of Eton produced many notable historical figures, such as Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. He went on to lead the British at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The Duke went on to say that Waterloo was won, quote, on the playing fields of Eton. This makes sense because he believed a good education led to a good soldier. The question is, did he actually say this? The quote has been linked to someone else, but no one knows for certain if Wellington delivered this classic line. In 1998, they found over 1,000 human bones in the basement of Benjamin Franklin's house. Don't worry, all you Benjamin Franklin lovers, this doesn't end with Ben being a murderous, kite-wielding maniac. It was revealed after further research that the bones were actually being kept there for research in anatomy and other medical practices. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie ignored warnings about terrorist threats in Sarajevo. What made their actions truly baffling is earlier that day, they survived a bomb thrown at their car. You'd think that would be a sign to call it a day, right? But no, they decided to visit the injured at the hospital. The problem? The driver didn't get the memo about the route change. While trying to fix his mistake, he turned down a side street, right where their assassin Gavrilo Princip was waiting. Princip didn't hesitate and fatally shot them both. That decision didn't just end their lives. It triggered World War I, killing 18 million people and changing history forever. Anasazi civilization is recognized as one of the oldest and most sophisticated cultures on the North American continent. In the late 13th century, the Anasazi abruptly abandoned their settlements, which included 5-story buildings and up to 800 distinct rooms. The tribe simply vanished. Legend has it that the Anasazi disappeared because they were going home. The disappearance of these mysterious people is of tremendous interest to those who believe in ancient alien theories, not least because of the associated myths and legends. These theorists also point to unusual patterns on the ruins of old Anasazi sites, such as circular lines resembling a spiral. According to mainstream research, the markings depict the sun. Those who accept the traditions of the Anasazi going home believe the markings are gateways or stargates, which could explain how the group vanished.